Well, Swati, I want to start talking about Swati by explaining that it's symbolized by coral. And if you look at coral, it just looks like a rock. But there's so much more that's going on with coral than it being a rock. Coral is actually a marine animal. And a couple of things about that particular animal is it secretes its own skeleton, right? So through what the individual has gone through, they form this hard exterior, this very firm shell through which they're interacting. Okay, that's one layer of it. Another thing about coral is able to reproduce asexually. Mm-hmm. Right, it's able to produce offspring just from within itself. If you hear a lot of stories in Hindu mythology about sages who do things like produce offspring from their sweat or from their speech or things like that. That's very much Swati energy. I like using the word self-perpetuation with Swati. There's a desire to kind of burst beyond particular boundaries that one is encountering, and to protect oneself from anything that comes up against what one feels one's path is. That's the hard exterior. With Swati, there's very much the process of, I want to pick the right word for it, associated more with what is moving within one than the actual external process that it's creating. It's associated with Vayu, which is a wind god. So it's about movement. It's about the spirit that flows inside of one. It's a very independent energy, right? So it's concerned, the independence that would be associated with Swati is concerned with that independence above all else. Not necessarily the things that it's trying to achieve through that independence, but more the fact that it's able to maintain that independence. Mm-hmm. And it's actually an Artha Nakshatra, which is, of course, related to directed activity, but the activities that it's undertaking and the pursuits that it is hoping to achieve are directed by and I don't want to be misunderstood with this because it's not always a negative process, it's directed by a self-centered process for the act of its own betterment. It's concerned only with its own betterment, creating something from itself.
Okay, well, and with this idea of Swati and thinking about Vayu being the deity and Vayu being associated with wind, and wind being associated with thought, and in the same way that water is associated with emotions and these sorts of things, and it's about self-centered action for one's own betterment. And I know you're going to get to this, but the idea of the basis above, basis below, the result, moving in different directions, change of form, transformation, that possibly planets placed in this nakshatra, again, whatever planet they are and whatever house they are ruling, that maybe that might show a person who in this lifetime is aiming to change and transform those areas of their life for the better.
Exactly, and they're going to have let's say, for instance, it was Mercury. The person would have their own ideas about how that would come into being.
Okay.
Or the philosophy that would guide that. And sure, they may listen to somebody else about that, mm-hmm. and take some and listen to the input that person gives them, but that input would mean absolutely nothing unless it came from inside of them.
Right. And so that's with like a planet by itself, such as Mercury. But like if we were thinking about the 11th Lord in Swati, dealing with social networks or honors or personal, achieving personal desires or gains and wealth, could that show that those areas of the person's life that they are working to kind of change from where it is into something greater or to something that will serve the person better?
Exactly, and you brought up an interesting point, which makes me want to take that a little bit deeper. Let's say the person, had very good intent. They wanted to do something for the betterment of humanity. So that sounds kind of conflicting with the with own betterment, right? But if that's one's path, that is one's own betterment.
Right.
You know, so they're wanting to follow that path. That's for their own betterment. So then they're going to, you know, just be very fierce towards achieving that, and focus on nothing but what that guiding impulse is. And sure, you're talking about social networking. They would use that that social networking for the betterment of humanity, whatever it is that they feel is their, you know, driving force or their centralized energy. And it's interesting, since you brought up that point, I feel guided to, you know, kind of mention the ruling planet here, which is Rahu. And with the nakshatras that are associated with Rahu and Ketu, obviously the Lord is going to be, you know, variable, right? So there's going to be a different tonality that's associated with that. You know, because Rahu and Ketu, as we both know, have no body of their own. They rely upon their lords. So in order to see if the planet that was in Swati Nakshatra was well supported, we'd have to look at the lord of Rahu.
Right.
And so there's going to be a little bit of that energy channeled into the process too. And so it becomes a very powerful force. That's, you know, and so there's also the meaning there with Rahu. What Rahu does is it brings things to the surface that are for the betterment of our own karma and what we're here for. So that's the positive connection with that. And I also like, another symbol of this nakshatra is a shoot of a plant blowing in the wind. And if we look at what happens when a small shoot continually has wind coming up against it, its stalk grows thicker, it grows stronger, it grows firmer. It either does one or two things. It either becomes so brittle within itself that wind comes and knocks it down, or it becomes somewhat flexible and pliable and moves with that wind and goes through a lot of different changes. But within itself, it's strong because it has to have that strength with which to face the resistance. But at the same time, it's flexible and willing to change. And you were mentioning the basis above, below, and the results. We'll go over that now, which is the basis above is moving in various directions. So there we have that sense of flexibility. Right, that willing to change, which happens with below. So the heavens are giving one the impulse to move in various directions for self-betterment. Basis below is the individual goes through several different changes of form. The result is transformation. Right, and of course the Trimurti association is with Shiva. So, you know, completely destroying the forms that are there, taking on new forms, destroying forms, taking on new forms. But ultimately, with the recognition of the spirit, the soul that's within one, if the planet is well supported, I recognize who I am, and for the sake of this only, and I'm not going to let anything or anybody deter me from that process, then I'm going to do this. Somebody may offer me advice on how I could do this better, but I'm not going to take that advice on unless it's something that I have made my own, through, you know, understanding and a subjective way of looking at it.
And just out of curiosity, I wonder how you, when we look at the Shakti, the power to scatter like the wind.
Power to scatter like the wind, correct.
Yeah, and the reason I'm curious about that is because when I think of that phrase, it brings up two connotations for me. One is that the power to scatter like the wind, in the same way that seeds are scattered. And so the wind has a power to help things grow beyond just where they come from, so to propagate. But also, when we think of scattering like the wind, that can also be like breaking up something to keep it from having power to cause a problem.
Exactly. You know, and if I can touch on that point, it's there's this concept within martial arts that if someone is coming to attack you, one of the best things that you can do is to turn to the side and let the force of their own attack propel them past you, and it will ultimately railroad them. So there is that concept of if one is facing something that's going to destroy what the form is, then, break it apart. And then we can even take that a step further, which is the concept of something is coming along which stands the chance of destroying this form. So instead, I'm going to destroy it myself out of my own will, but then potentially put it back together in a different manner, rather than have something else come along and take it away from me. A very restless, independent energy with Swati. What I've encountered with people who, let's say, for instance, they have their moon or their ascendant in Swati, you'll never see these people sitting still. Not for an instant. They may sit down for 5 minutes, but then they're up feeling like they always have to be, engaged in doing something.
Right. And that would apply just in general with house lords. For example, maybe 10th house lord, they're always trying to do something new or changing their career or direction in life. Or with the 9th house lord, maybe they're, always changing their belief systems or, the kind of culture that they identify with. So it can give, in my mind, when I think about this, maybe it's a very similar energy to having a planet in the 8th house where it's almost as if it always needs to change and always needs to transform and doesn't quite feel comfortable unless there is something new going on.
Exactly.
And
yes.
that would be important to know, especially if someone's coming to an astrologer and they want to know about their career and they're saying, why can't I just find the one thing that makes me happy? Why can't I settle down? And then you look and you see that either their ascendant lord or their 10th house lord or even their 10th cusp maybe is in Swati. Then you can explain to them, well, your path, your direction isn't meant to just sit down on one thing, but it is meant to explore and change and alter as you go, just consistently. Does that sound accurate?
Yes, exactly. And that's an important point, is especially with Swati energy. There's not a fixed way to do that, and we tend to judge ourselves by other people's experiences of what we're seeing around us, and then sometimes think that there's something wrong with us because we're not like everybody else. And there's nothing wrong with us because we're not like everybody else. There's something that's very right about us, and the well-supported Swati individual would come to the realization of that. Right. They'd go, there's everything in the world absolutely right about me because I don't, I'm not like this person, or I'm not like that person, or I'm always changing this or always changing that. Mm-hmm. That person would be passionate about change.
Right.
Very passionate about change. So they, if they're having trouble with their career, they've got a career planet that's in Swati, they're having a hard time connecting with that. Yes, it's about helping them to understand that there's absolutely nothing wrong with changing one's career several times. As a matter of fact, that might be part of their dharma so that they can learn several different things so that they can use it at some, future moment.
Right. And taking that, for example, sometimes when I get people who come to me and they ask about career, and I'll see that they have the 10th house or 10th cusp in a mutable sign. Well, oftentimes I'll tell them that, maybe they're meant to have like dual careers or they follow multiple paths at one time. So I know this isn't quite applicable, but it can be kind of a similar energy. Do you think? Would they be doing more than one thing at a time, or is it pretty much just consistent transformation, one thing at a time, but always changing that thing?
Well, it's interesting that you brought that up, because I think it would be more always changing that thing, but you're going to find with the next nakshatra, which is Vishaka, that person would probably be more guided towards doing a couple of different things.
Okay.
At the same time when we get to it. But I do want to touch on, because we didn't mention, I think there was something that we forgot to mention. We did the power to scatter like the wind. I was trying to see if tamasic, and sattvic.
Yes.
So very, firm, very solid exterior. But that exterior is propelled forward by a realization or an understanding or a balanced way of looking at things. It has knowledge or understanding about why it's being so firm. It's got a purpose, very much has a purpose.
So how do you what's the word? So when I'm thinking about something changing form and transformation, and I'm thinking about tamasic and sattvic, to me the change and transformation sounds a little more like a rajasic energy. So how do we reconcile kind of the energy, the Shakti, the basis, and the result with the gunas. How can you reconcile that?
Well, because the Shakti that's going on inside. So let's look again at coral. So it's dense outside, completely firm, but inside there's a lot of movement.
I see. Okay.
But that movement is the person's more concerned with what's going on inside, but in order to preserve what's going on inside, there has to be the firm exterior.
Right. Okay, I see. That
So
makes sense.
It's still very tamasic, right? And it's aware of all the processes that are going on inside of it. It's self-aware of those things, but it's having to be dense and firm for the preservation of that spirit.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, the chemistry going on inside the cauldron. The cauldron is holding the reactions, or the test tube or whatever it might be, is holding the reactions, but the reaction, and that's the tamasic part, but the reactions are still going on inside of that receptacle or that vessel.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Excellent.